Welcome back to part 4. In this video we're going to reassemble the engine, ready to be reunited with the car. We have our repaired flexi. Now this is a plug alert. Myriad in Warsaw did this. The link should be on display now and their contact details. So this is a genuine BMW Mini DPF catalytic converter. Scrap value of this is 250 quid. Forget the flexi. A brand new one, probably 2 grand. So just for this, it's an awful lot of money to fork out when you've got a dodgy flexi. So this has saved us a lot of money. It's a brand new flexi, welded on, and they've done a good job. So I'm glad to have that. So our first challenge in this video is we have to tighten these flywheel bolts up to 120 Newton meters each. And there's no way of pinning this crank or locking it, and even just slightly moves the flywheel. So we need a way of locking the flywheel. Right, so you can buy a tool to clamp and hold flywheel, but I made one. This is a spare injector clamp, and I've basically filed the ends down, or used my grinder stone to do that. And now it'll go in there, and I'll bolt it through one of these holes to hold the flywheel. So with that in place, I can now torque up my flywheel bolts. So with my flywheel torqued up, it's now time to put the clutch on. There are 2 things really are significant here. One is the clutch is labelled a gearbox side and flywheel side. So that's your gearbox side, and then that would be flywheel side. So basically it goes like that. So that's important. Now the other thing is you can buy a locator tool. But once again, I've made one. This is a gearbox that I scrapped, and we just took the original locator spline out of it so that fits perfectly. Just put the bolts in very loosely. When it tightens up, it will clamp the clutch in place. Now, if you don't have a locator tool, then you can do it by eye, and you can see that is not lined up. Now, what you're looking for is the far hole to be in the center of the second, that ring there. So that needs to go up. Right, so if we look in there now, you can see that that's central, so we're good to go. These bolts now need to be torqued up to 23 Newton meters each. I'm going to fit the gearbox back onto the engine, but we've got a new thrust bearing, which is this. You can offer the gearbox up to the engine and start putting the bolts in. So if you've got an extra pair of hands, it's very useful. If you've got an assistant, I haven't, so I'm using the lifting gear to support this. I'm just going to line up the holes, put a bolt through and get it threaded, and I'm going to put 2 or 3 in and then just ease the gearbox in. So a couple of turns this side, a couple of turns the other, and then match it all up. As you can see, the gearbox is lining up nicely. We are getting there. So the starter motor is the next one in. Now, as I mentioned in one of my early videos, I put all the bolts back in the holes where I can. So that's how I know these are the starter motor bolts, and they go in like that. So we're going to put the starter motor in next. Right, as to torque wrench settings, these are 12mm bolts. They are 66 Newton meters, and these smaller bolts, which are 8mm, these are 20 Newton meters. These ones go down here. So gearbox is on, all the bolts are torqued. I'm now going to build up the exhaust side, the turbo side of the engine. There's more to that, to be fair. It's also at the back. So we're going to get the exhaust manifold on now and everything else. So DPF and catalytic converter is next up. Now this bracket, do be careful with it, it's quite brittle, so don't overstretch it. That is also held on by this bracket. So I'm going to put the bracket on first, onto the block. Then I'm going to bolt the DPF, and those are the bolts that this go onto, that supports it there. That's the DPF and the cat fitted, so that bracket there and that bracket there. Now before you put this shield on, fit this, otherwise you won't be able to do it. So that goes up to here for the turbo oil feed and supply. Right, so our top heat shield is on and it's bolted, and this also, the oil line is bolted. This, as you can imagine, would be almost impossible to do with the engine in. Now there is a particular order you need to put these heat shields on, and it's this bottom one first. Now don't put this in until you've sorted this out, because this bracket has to come back off, and you can't get that off unless this oil drain is removed, because that has to come off this way. And when that's free, this can go on, the bracket can go back on, the oil drain can go back on, and then we put this next one on here. Right, so brackets on, but don't tighten these up yet, because you can see those aren't lined up. Keep those loose, then they get the next shield on, and then the top shield on, and then tighten everything up. So with the top shield on, you can now see where all the final bolts go. This one also says a bolt with this lower one. So we've just got to fix this on now, and that's this side done, and the next job we'll put the EGR cooler on and the EGR. Right, so now we're going to put the EGR cooler on, which is this beastie. Now, we've had our head reconditioned, so bits have been taken off. This bracket goes on there, and then EGR will be bolted to these two bolts, so don't forget to put those back in. So one of the advantages of using our little drawer system is that when you find something that you don't know where it goes, you know you forgot to put it on. So one of the downsides of my drawer system is when you find a bracket, you go, bugger, where did that come from? Now this is the turbo support bracket, and I'd forgotten it, so I've actually loosened this shield here, and it goes in there. It's actually achievable to not remove too much to put it on. 3 bolts, which I have, and that's going to go back on, and I'll put this back on. All right, so back to our EGR. So you can see now that turbo bracket is on, EGR bracket is on, so this should now bolt straight onto there, and I'll see you in a minute when that's all secure. Right, so now with EGR cooler back on now, I'm now going to reattach this water pipe, the intake manifold, and I will come back on camera when that's all on. So one mistake I've made that you can avoid is this is the fuel drain. It's actually got to go up here. So I'm going to take my intake manifold off again, feed that in the right place, and then put it back. But just make sure this comes through. There's a gap down here which you can feed through. Right, intake manifold on. And now if you haven't already, make sure that these end cap bolts are 10 Newton meters each. I've actually put the engine back on the gantry, and I'm going to put the engine back in the car so that I can then lift it to a good working height. The chains are gone. There's nothing in the way really to put the rock cover on and the rest of it. So what we're going to do now is put the engine mount on back on here, and get this engine back supported in the car. Right, engine in. I've just put it on these 2 top mounts here. There's no bottom mount on just yet. What I will do is I'll put the rock cover on, put the injectors in, and start building up the wiring loom and so on. It's just, I can move the car up and down now. The engine's more secure. It's just easier to work on. Okay, so rock cover's on now. I'm going to put the injectors in. Now the injectors are coded to each cylinder. So we did label them. Unfortunately, some of the paint's come off. That's number 2. So we've reconditioned the cylinder head, so we know those bores are clean. Make sure the bottoms of these washers are clean. It's probably a good idea to replace the washers if you have them. So I would say it's not totally essential. So that's number 1. There are numbers on the top of here, and on the diagnostic you can go in and check. So I'm hoping that's a 4 and that's a 3. Here's our fuel rail, and here's our clamps for the fuel rail. Okay, so we have the injectors in and clamped down, and I've put the drain line on as well and put the clips in there. So we are now ready to start putting the loom back on the car. That'll be next. It's probably best to lay this out in a logical way. So resting that on top of there. This is the crankshaft sensor. So that's gone behind the EGR cooler, and I'm going to push that down the back. That's where it's going to go. All right, well, the sensor's in. In the end, it wasn't that difficult, but I disconnected the connector, and now it's in. So that means I've just got to connect this up, which is a bit of a feely job, but not impossible. So that's on now. So a couple of connections are tucked away, or to be sure you get right. So there's obviously one on the top there, but there's also one down there, okay, underneath. This is on the throttle body. This excuse me, is into there. So that's a connector there. This one goes onto the solenoid for the starter. So there's a small connector there. The big red one goes onto the back, that bolt there, which also goes up to here and onto the main wiring. This one is straight into the back there. So maybe you've got to see on the camera, but I'm going to try and get a better angle. There we go. So we can see what's going on too. There. Because these fuel lines have got to go behind the starter, then that's clamped on there. So I'm going to loosen the starter off, these two bolts, put that in place, tighten them back up again, and then put the fuel lines in place. All right, so that's better. The fuel lines are now going behind the starter motor, clamped to there, and yeah, so we're in a much neater place now. We need to put the dipstick in. Do not forget to tighten this, which is the fuel pump line. We loosened it earlier when we were playing with the engine when it's out of the car. So we tighten that one up. And then we're going to go to this part of the loom, bolt that on and put everything on the top. So these vacuum lines can be a bit of a puzzler. So there's a red and a blue and a black. So the red goes to there, the blue goes to there, the black goes, see this go through there, it comes out here, and this is a vacuum pipe that goes onto that point there, and this is where the black small pipe goes onto. So this you can break quite easily. You need to obviously get a new one if you do. The wiring loom's on now, and we are getting quite close to be able to start the car. I've got to put some oil in it. I've got to change the oil filter, which I'll do now. I've got to connect those fuel lines. So that's the fuel line I looped, stop it dripping, connect them onto there. I'm going to connect the clutch into the right place, which I don't need to do to start it, but I'm going to do while I'm down there. I've already connected the gear linkages. Connect the battery before you connect the ECU. I repeat, because if you don't, you get a spark on there, you can blow the footwell module. So connect the battery and then the ECU, and then we're going to try and start it. Okay, so we've got oil in the car. We've connected our fuel lines. I've connected the clutch area. Now, before I do carry on, I'm going to connect this dirty grey pipe, which goes in there, simply because it's a lot easier to do it now than it is later. You don't need to do it this moment, actually. But the fact of the matter is, once it's in, so we'll get it done. Right, it's worth going over the coolant hoses. I definitely recommend doing this before you put the front on. So there's two coolant hoses coming down the back, all right? One's got a vent in it. That sits to the right. The other one, they sort of cross over at the back. The other one comes through here. There's a little clip there, and it goes to here. The one with a vent on it connects, and that goes onto the radiator and goes to the top here. So, it took me a while fiddling, and it is a fiddle because they kind of clutch onto here. This is tight onto here, and it's all underneath, and you don't want to foul any of this stuff, right? You don't want to mess with that. So you've got your coolant hoses now clipped on. There's a securing point there. There's a little clip inside there, and these all clip on pretty neatly when they're there. I'm ready to start the car. Now we've broken the fuel lines, which means there's going to be air in these fuel lines, which means it ain't going to start straight away. So what I've done is I've basically put a piece of wood in there to put the clutch on so that I can just lean in and crank it. Then as it's cranking, what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen one or two of these, undo, tighten, to let air out. You only need to get it firing one or two, then it'll suck all the fuel and the air through anyway. So that's how we do it. I can't really do it on camera, but that's what I'm going to be doing now. And there she goes. She's running. And with that, I'm signing off. Well, I'm very happy with my day's work. Engine's in and running. So obviously still a lot of work to do. Got to get the front end on, etc. But I know the engine runs, it sounds fine. So I hope it's been useful to you. It's hopefully my mistakes will mean that you spend less time doing this job. Thanks for watching.